I'm Aria from Liberal Reform. We promote personal liberty, free markets and globalism within the Liberal Democrats. You can find out more about us here. We've interviewed each of the contenders to be our London Mayoral Candidate. You'll hear a little bit about their experience, their plans and their policies, and we hope you find these useful in deciding how to cast your vote.
Sure. I'll start with why I'm running. I believe Brexit is the sort of fundamental issue of our time, and it's something we really need to focus on in everything we do because it affects everything we believe in and care about. And for me, that's primarily actually a moral issue. When I look at my European friends, my European neighbours, my European family, it's absolutely essential that we protect EU citizens and that we also see the EU as an amazing force for good in the world, whether or not it's on things like climate change or international security. So it's a moral issue, but it's also a practical issue. Almost every big issue we care about is affected in some way. Transport for London has already been struggling financially because of Sadiq Khan's fares freeze, but it also has falling passenger numbers. That means falling revenue. Falling revenue means less money to invest in phasing out polluting buses and taxis. It also means less money for tube maintenance. And if we know one thing that people really hate in their everyday lives in London, it's the tube or trains breaking down, the enormous amount of stress it causes for people. Yeah, as a parent, when I have to go and pick up my kids from school, if you are late, it's both deeply unfair on the people who have to look after them and very stressful for you. So that's one example. Another example is the NHS. 1 in 6 NHS workers in London are EU citizens, completely reliant on them. I had an operation earlier this year. I had a broken neck. So as it got fixed, I got fixed by EU doctors and EU nurses who are absolutely amazing. And so our entire city is deeply international. It's a deep part of our liberalism. We need to defend that. And I think from a political point of view, we've not had an opportunity like this since at least the Iraq War to connect to a large number of people who are being let down by the other parties. And for those people, it's both a practical issue, so it affects their jobs, it affects the NHS, it affects everything else, but it's also a gut issue for people because it represents the sort of world they want to live in. So that's why I'm standing. When I tell you about myself, it probably might make sense why I care so deeply about that. I'll go backwards in time from the present. So I spent the last couple of years running my own company, advising people on digital marketing and strategy. One of my clients is Best for Britain, the anti-Brexit campaign, and I've been working very closely on that campaign on how do we actually win the next public vote when it happens. And I believe we have a good opportunity of doing that, as long as we listen carefully to what the country is telling us. So I'm very optimistic we can stop Brexit. We've not got long, obviously, but I think things are looking actually much more positive than they were even a few months ago. I also work on sort of complex issues around communications, like fake news. So recently working on vaccinations and how do you make sure people keep on having their children vaccinated. It's a big problem across all rich countries at the moment, that people have less faith in the government, less willing to believe authority. And there's many good things we'd think about that as liberals, but one of the problems of that, you've got falling vaccination levels. That means more people getting sick with completely preventable diseases. Going one step back in my career, before that, I spent 15 years in communications, working with people like the Climate Change Convention. I think of interest to many of liberal reform people, I think, is the way in which climate change has made lots of progress in recent years has been not just getting the people like me who believe deeply in the environment on board, but also getting all the people who aren't motivated quite so much and showing them why it matters to them. For instance, China's now starting to take climate change seriously. That's because of localized air pollution more than anything else, because people in China are dying very early because of bad air pollution from coal-fired power stations. So I think the climate change example is actually something I'd love to do if elected, which is really work on how do you broaden constituencies for progressive causes. And I think quite often in the modern world, the liberal left has actually been quite poor at building broad coalitions, even though we probably have the majority of society who at some level agree with us. Taking one step further back on my career, I worked for the Liberal Democrats for some years as an economics and policy advisor, and I worked very closely with Charles Kennedy at the time of the Iraq War. And I saw then something which I can see again now, which is when you are right on the biggest issue it faces a country, you're going to face a lot of abuse and a lot of attacks. And I think for a lot of Lib Dems are a little bit uncomfortable with that. I can't like being liked by everyone. But actually, I think we should be proud of that. If Ian Duncan Smith is angry with you or Nigel Farage is angry with you, on the whole, that's a good thing. It shows we're doing the right thing. I'd much rather we were attacked for doing the right thing than we were just ignored the way we have been at many points in our history. So the first one of which is, obviously, we've got to show how Brexit matters the whole way through everything we do. And for at least the next 6 months, that's going to have to be our primary campaign and really 90% of our time and effort. If Brexit doesn't happen, there will be a whole set of spin-offs about how Britain changes after that. Who knows what will happen to the other political parties. But if it does happen, there's going to be a lot of clearing up the mess. EU citizens, protecting them and helping them survive that is incredibly important. Even if you didn't believe in it from a moral point of view, from a practical point of view, it's absolutely essential to our city being a success. And then on other issues, which obviously interlock with this very closely, I'm very concerned about air pollution in London. It's become a very serious problem in recent years, partly because the government mistakenly encouraged people to move into diesel about 15 years ago. So we have far too much pollution in central London, and there's a whole series of things we need to do to fix that. Speed up the phase out of polluting buses, get taxis which drive around all day, so create a lot of pollution, to phase out polluting taxis faster, various things on delivery vans, getting their packages delivered closer to home. There's a whole sort of set of things around air pollution. And then the other big issue for me really is crime, which is we've had a significant increase in crime in recent years. And I think part of that is quite easily explainable. So we've had a fall in police numbers. And where the police have been taken out of is community policing. And what happens is if a small police team patrols an area regularly over time, they build relationships with people. Talk to Brian Paddock about this, and he will say, well, you build those relationships and people just tell you things, not big enough things they'd ever bother phoning the police about, but often those things are the clues that allow the police to identify a problem. And that's a problem they can often solve and then prevent crimes in the first place. So that sort of more police is one part of it, but another part of it is dealing with slightly more fundamental drivers. And mental health problems are a huge driver of criminal problems. Within a few weeks of us leaving government in 2015, Conservatives cut £200 million in public health. A huge chunk of that came out of substance abuse work. So a lot of people who were coping or would have coped with substance abuse problems lapsed back into substance abuse. And we know that people with drug and alcohol problems commit a disproportionate proportion of crimes. So simply as an incredibly bad place to cut money. You see the spin-off effects very quickly. And of course, you get costs elsewhere in the system, in prisons and policing very quickly. On my road, regularly seeing broken glass on my road where somebody's broken into a car at night to steal £2, doing probably £200 worth of damage in that process. So treating substance abuse and mental health is incredibly important. It also happens to solve a lot of our other social problems or help solve them. So we have a lot more kids that have been taken into care in the last 5 years. Extremely expensive, not very good for the kids, not great for their education over time. A lot of that, and of course, eventually many of those kids will end up in bad situations. A lot of that comes out of their parents not being able to cope with them anymore. And that's something you can see we're doubling in the last sort of 10 years or so. And I could keep on going about crime stuff for ages. One other thing I'd say is a lot of this also depends on having a mayor who follows through on the detail. And a really good example of that's not being done is what's called the Cardiff model. And that's something Lib Dems have been talking about now for 10 years, which is the idea that you get hospitals to share anonymized data on who suffers violence, because 2/3 to 3/4 of violent crime isn't reported to the police. Victims don't think they'll be taken seriously, domestic abuse, gang stuff. There's a whole range of reasons. So a lot of the data isn't captured by the police. And if you start to spot patterns in the data, you can often start to solve the problems as well. Equally, youth workers in hospitals are often very important to helping divert teenagers from crime. That's something we actually put into the coalition agreement. I went and started to chase it up in 2012, and it's still actually not quite fixed, because fixing it is mainly a sort of operational challenge for hospitals. It requires slightly different IT. It requires constant pressure from politicians, and both Boris Johnson and Sadiq Khan are actually very poor at following that up. This is actually a very good example of how all these things are interlocked. One of the key things there is actually mental health problems. A lot of people actually on the streets have a serious mental health problem, and that's one of the reasons they don't get off the streets. It's not just a pure lack of housing, it's a dependency and all sorts of things that come to do with being on the streets. So at one level, fixing mental health actually has a lot of very positive spin-offs of other things. The other thing, really, is to try and crack the political debate on what you do about developing on land that's low quality but currently defined as being greenfield in some way. I sort of completely understand people want to protect beautiful places, but there's plenty of stuff that is technically called greenfield that is nothing like it. So I can show you photos of Tottenham Hale tube station directly opposite. There's basically an old industrial lot that is defined technically as greenfield. Makes no sense whatsoever. Would be a very obvious place to develop housing right next to a tube station. And the way I think we can unlock that is to try and align the interests of people who live in areas to the people who want to develop housing. And actually the Lib Dem Council in Sutton has been fantastically good at doing this. We've actually had quite a lot of house building go on there. And they have a rule which is you've got to make the environment better by building to get permission. And they split that into three things, really. The first one of which is it has to be carbon neutral. So you've got to have very energy efficient housing, and then for the bit you can't work with sometimes, you have to buy offsets to make sure it's carbon neutral for the life of the housing. So that means you get really good high quality housing. Secondly, biodiversity. So the borough as a whole has to come out of the building with better biodiversity. So if you're going to build on something, it probably has to be fairly low quality land, or maybe it's a field that has just some grass in it, but not much more than that. And in its place, you have to either plant things that will drive biodiversity, bee-friendly plants, appropriate trees, etc. Or you have to find some other way to make something more biodiverse. And then the third part of it is green spaces, is to say that every development has to net increase the amount of green space in the borough. And so I think a lot of the time when people are against building, it's because they worry that the area around them will end up feeling too dense. And by protecting the green spaces and forcing developments to sort of build them into them, makes it much easier to get people on board. And that's why Sutton ultimately can still survive as a Lib Dem council with a Lib Dem majority, despite lots of building, because we've managed to buy people into that. And that's something I think the mayor across London can try and push more, because obviously, stuff doesn't get built for a political reason. But if you can solve that, you can solve a lot of problems. On private renters are a huge and growing group in our city. And the market breaks down for private renting quite badly, because before you rent a house, it's very hard to tell how high quality it really is, because a lot of the stuff isn't regulated, and it's very hard to regulate in time. So a whole load of things we can do to improve the private renting market. I think longer leases would make the market much higher quality. And the second thing is we've got to recognise most landlords only own one or two houses, and that means they're amateurs. And so when they maybe don't have the best house, or they break the law accidentally, it's not intentional most of the time. Now, if you're a private renter, that doesn't really matter to you. You still suffer from that. But it does mean with the landlords, there's a lot of things we can do to put gentle pressure on them to up their game, to force them to put in proper insulation, for instance, and force them to be more responsive to their tenants over time. And I think the mayor can do a lot to try and push on that, so that landlords are nudged in the right direction. Because obviously, what we can't expect them to do a lot of the time is act like highly professional big companies, because they're not. They're small businesses. It's normally they have a job and it's just something to do for a little bit of income. And we've got to find a way of getting them bought in, providing high quality housing. Some of that obviously has to be giving tenants greater rights, so that the landlords have a stronger interest to have a good relationship with their tenants. So I think the first thing to say is it's incredibly important to everyone in London for the obvious reason that most of us commute on public transport. If you talk to experts on happiness, they say that once you take out sort of marriage, divorce, all these like really big human events, basically the biggest source of unhappiness in most people's lives is commuting. And commuting that breaks down is worse because it's unexpected. So actually fixing the transport system is incredibly important. And I think there's a couple of things you can do quite quickly. The first one of which obviously is fixing Brexit, because that starts to fix your passenger numbers issue. The second one of which is focusing more on making the system work well, not just building big new things. It is important in the long run in London we do build new tube and train lines, but that's a thing that if you do it as mayor today, most of them won't open for 20 years. We need to be trying fixing the things that will pay off quickly. Firstly, it's getting maintenance right, so tubes and trains don't break down. Secondly, I think our policy on early bird fares before 7:30 is actually a very powerful policy, because it takes people off crowded tubes and trains after 7:30 in the morning at peak times, and gets on the less crowded trains. Also, I think at a sort of more practical level, most people feel they kind of should be rewarded for moving off peak, and we don't really do enough of that. And then the final thing is something as Lynn Featherstone used to talk a lot about, actually, and this is something I'll probably do in Power, it's probably less of a campaigning issue, is we know that a lot of people take the wrong route to work, and we spend longer on public transport than we need to. And that actually wastes capacity. We know that because after every tube strike, a few percent of people who were commuting one way change route. And literally being forced by a tube strike to try a different route actually helps them find a better route. Well, actually, there's a lot of things we could do to try and encourage people to take different routes. And the fantastic thing about that is it's incredibly cheap. If you get people to walk more between tube stations, that's incredibly cheap. In theory, we have a tube map that exists in London which shows walking distances between stations. In practice, you never see it anywhere. So there's a lot of stuff you can do around that. And I've worked on sort of behaviour change campaigns with government where often those little subtle nudges can be incredibly good value for money. The final thing, and again, this is something that pays off a little bit every year, is to try and improve cycling in London. And it has started to get a little bit better in recent years, but we should really be aiming for it to be much closer to what it's like in Amsterdam. Simply because cycling is this incredible thing that is unpolluting and gets people fit. Cyclists on average, compared to a peer group, live something like 5 years longer. And you don't need to go to a gym and spend money. It's incredibly accessible to everyone. It really should be the thing we are encouraging more than anything else. And most journeys in London are pretty short. So there's a lot we can do to encourage cycling. Obviously, it's already on the up, but we should be aiming to increase it quite a lot further.
And what about ride-hailing apps, the whole Uber debacle with Steve Khan?
So this is a really weird challenge, I think, for someone like me, because in principle, I'm massively in favour of them. Uber is a fantastic service run by gangsters. And I'm not exaggerating. If you look at their behaviour, they threaten people, they lie, they don't treat people well. They've been unethical in so many different ways as a company. Now, that doesn't mean they should be banned, but it does mean we have to treat them like gangsters, and we have to be extremely strong in monitoring them, and we have to make sure that we hold them to their word on everything, because we can't just trust them to do what they promise they'll do. That said, obviously a lot of people use them and enjoy them, and they're great in that way. I think inevitably they're going to have to end up becoming a little bit more expensive for the simple reason that one of the reasons buses are getting slower in central London at the moment is there are so many taxis on the road of all sorts that the traffic's actually starting to slow down. And if that's the private cars with 1 or 2 people and slowing a bus down with 60 people, it makes no sense. So that will probably at peak times make them a little bit more expensive. Actually, I don't think that's where the real benefit of things like Uber are. The real benefit is when you're in the suburbs, much lower density, where it might be getting the Uber for 5 minutes to a train station that would have been actually quite hard on public transport or quite a long walk. And I think that's where you find a lot of people on really quite modest incomes use Uber quite a lot because they can't afford a car, and it fills gaps that wouldn't exist otherwise.